Once I got to the cannibalism story, I just like...
It was all over for you.
Yeah, it was pretty much like, that's the one for me.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never fear change. Life is too short for fear. Chase what is desired.
I can do this all day.
Would you mind identifying what you are?
We're the best friends squad.
That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team.
Welcome to the rodeo. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
This is the way.
I have spoken.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show, Reading Rangers-ish.
Celebrating African speculative fiction.
That's an interesting tagline, Jen, because it's blatantly obvious from the title of the episode.
Yeah.
So if you didn't know, the title is actually totally misleading. We're actually only looking at things from southern Arkansas today.
Exactly. Southern Arkansas. Where on earth did you get that from?
I just had to pick like the most unlikely place that we'd ever focus on. And southern Arkansas seemed like it. No offense, Arkansans, but...
I mean, there are people from the African diaspora who probably do live in southern Arkansas.
That's true.
I'm not going to, eliminate that as a possibility. However, that is not what we're here to discuss today, necessarily.
I'm going to say definitely, given the bios that I read. None of them are from southern Arkansas. No offense to southern Arkansas. We're actually talking about the Nommo Awards today for short stories specifically. And that's because Jen said we should do it.
Yeah, we did this, I don't know, 2 years ago or last year, maybe both years. I can't remember now because my brain is fried. But in case you don't know what the Nommo Awards are, it is put on by ASFIS, which is the African Speculative Fiction Society. It is an award specifically for works written by African and African diaspora writers.
Right.
And we're doing the short stories. There are 4 categories that they do in the Nommo Awards, which are novels, novellas, short fiction, and comics. So we've decided to talk about the short fiction category because those are the ones that we can read in a reasonable amount of time. And also the Nommo Awards really just highlight some of the best speculative fiction coming out of Africa and the African diaspora. So it seemed like a good place to start.
Absolutely. Before we get that, we do have to say a thank you to somebody who joined our Patreon.
Yay! Thank you to Adri the Astronomical for becoming a Patreon patron. You are awesome and we love you. We appreciate you becoming a patron.
It's very special and we appreciate it quite a lot. As always, if you want to join our Patreon page and support what we do, you can go to patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty. $1 is all it takes per month. You can donate more if you like. 3 million would be great because Jen and I could basically only do this all the time. Anyway, so on the subject of this show, we're going to talk about each of the stories. There are 6. So I think we're going to start with Tiny Bravery by Ada Nadi. So this story is called Tiny Bravery, and it is a story that takes place primarily in, I guess what you'd call like that New Mutants facility that they keep trying to make that New Mutants movie. It's kind of like that. It's people that have spontaneously grown these unique powers. One of the characters has grown wings, and our main character has invisibility. And they essentially exist in a facility where they are being essentially trained on whether or not they can go back into regular society. Obviously, they all have their own sort of unique issues, which I'm sure we'll talk about here. And that's kind of basic plot is our main character, who is invisible and spends most of the time being in the story being invisible, meets this new character who has grown wings, but desperately doesn't want them and doesn't want any of the power that comes with it. And it sort of talks about their friendship as they develop together to sort of appreciate and accept themselves in their own unique ways. And there are some specific reasons for why acceptance is difficult for them, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we kind of essentially put up a spoiler wall.
Yeah, so spoiler wall.
Yeah.
So I really loved this story because it's not so much a New Mutants type of facility unless you're referring to like Xavier's Mansion.
I was thinking in terms of the new movie that they're working on, though, the one where, but without as much creepy, but in terms of it's a place where they get sent.
But within the context of this story, it's actually not a bad place to be sent. It is a place that teaches you either to accept your abilities, or in the instances where you cannot accept or do not want your abilities after going through therapy and whatnot, you can take a cure. So it's very different from what the New Mutants go through, which is a very antagonistic approach to powers. So this is really about two characters learning to accept themselves and their traumas, or coming to grips with their traumas in really interesting ways. So the two characters are a girl named Ahsoken, who you actually learn is not her name.
Right.
But she goes by Ahsoken for the majority of the story. And she has the gift of invisibility, but the problem is that she's using it constantly as a way to protect herself from trauma. And that trauma is that she has lost a sister, her twin sister specifically. And so she's afraid that if she goes visible again, that basically will mean the end of her sister. And she doesn't want to lose her sister or her connection to her.
There's another dynamic, and it's pretty subtle. The implication is that she's also had some sort of injury to her face, because when she looks in the mirror, she no longer sees her sister. She sees a different person.
Oh, that's right.
It's really subtle, though.
Yeah, no, she was injured. You're right. That's a really good point, because the explosion that killed her sister also damaged her.
Right.
She's lost her sister's face, but she has not lost her voice, and so she's trying to exist only as a voice.
Exactly, yeah.
Meanwhile, you have Chinwei, who comes from a fundamentalist background, who you kind of get the idea they don't necessarily accept these powers or people that have the powers. And so she's afraid of herself and afraid of what her powers mean. And she has a very high visibility power, which is these giant wings. And it's really fascinating watching her. I mean, it's just fascinating watching both of them come to terms with those things. Like, because one of her problems, she's afraid of heights. God, how awful would it be?
And you're missing another detail.
Oh, I am missing a detail. Oh, I love it. Tell me details.
She also mentions that her sexuality is not the one that's expected of her, which is another one of those things that sort of gets mentioned, but isn't. It's very subtle. This is like some Hemingway type writing, which is like, well, I'm just going to mention something, and then like you have to figure that shit out on your own, which I really enjoyed in this story. That
I did too.
The things that were explained were largely by the characters performing them or saying them directly. And a lot of the other stuff you kind of have to piece together, which I personally enjoy in fiction. I know not everybody likes it. They like things being spelled out a bit more. For me, I like having that because it increases readability. I don't like to read things and then not think about it again or to go back. And this one has lots of like little bits. Even when we get to the section when they're having essentially a group meeting where it's all of the young people who have their abilities with their therapist, and there's like little nuggets of like how each character acts. So there's Grace, who is like super pushy and is constantly like jabbing and poking at other people. And it tells us a lot about like what kind of person she is. Even just what you're saying, like Chinwei, whose ability is super visible, has a moment at one point when she's trying to get to the chair and the wings are just like jostling her about. And the therapist is like, well, why don't you just relax and let the wings do their thing? And she does, and the result is the wings essentially kind of lightly bring her to the chair. And so there's these like beautiful little moments throughout in which you can kind of figure out a lot about the world and the way that these powers are being treated, and even about the characters, just by sort of paying attention to the small details.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I mean, I'm going to just say it now. This has ended up probably being my personal favorite story because of things like that. And because it was just a joyful story, even while exploring some pretty deep traumas.
Yeah.
That both of the characters are coping with. And I love that kind of outcome. It just makes me smile because we all carry around our traumas. And like the reason it's called Tiny Bravery is that there's a line right at the end that says, "One day at a time, nothing grand, nothing impressive, just living." And that idea of how it can be a struggle to exist on a daily basis with all sorts of things, including, disabilities or personal challenges or traumas or whatnot. Once they're sort of incorporated into the person and one's sense of identity, that they can become, if not necessarily a benefit, but they can become almost a superpower unto themselves because you're whole again. And I really loved that about this story.
It's interesting because I wouldn't say this is my favorite story, but this one surprised me the most.
It did, yeah.
Because I usually, if I'm totally honest, I generally kind of hate fiction about superhero stuff. I just, for whatever reason, it never works for me.
Right.
And I can handle it in comics, and I think it's just because it's a visual medium, and so I don't know, there's something weird about me. So when I read this, I was like, oh god, it's some superhero stuff. Like, you're gonna have wings, and you're gonna, like, learn their powers, and they're gonna, like, save some person from a bus, or, like, you know, get some cats out of the tree or something, or if not cats, I don't know, like, errant children or something. That's kind of where I was starting from, and then I was like, oh wait, no, this is actually, like, about mental health, and the sense of being okay with yourself or dealing with your internal traumas. And it has a really nice ending, which is not this kind of like everything's fixed and we're all fine, but more like these little tiny, hence the title, right? These little tiny steps towards finding that comfort in the self.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that the main character ends by basically coming out in the sense of the invisibility, right? Taking off the invisibility in front of their parents,
yeah,
which is such a big deal because the very beginning of the story reminds us that, like, they've spent the entire time trying only to be visible when they have to because it may be harmful for them to stay invisible all the time. I think it was a lovely surprise as a story.
It is, and it's a really sweet queer love story too. So
it is. There's a little bit of that, yeah.
And it's a YA queer love story. So, like, it's such a little, like, ball of delight for me. And I really enjoyed it.
It's a good story.
It is a good story.
It's a really good story. Yeah, it's feel good. You feel kind of good. I like it. I think that's important, though. Like, having stories where you kind of feel good at the end. I mean, right now everything's kind of on fire, and it's hard to see that.
Yeah.
You know, the whole year's just been a disaster. And so I know this came out last year, so I'm sure last year was also a disaster. But I don't know, there's something I think very cathartic about reading something that's like, oh, that's sweet. It doesn't fix everything going on in your life, but it makes things like feel a little better.
Yeah. And this is from a Nigerian writer. Ada Nadi is studying at the University of Lagos, specifically studying psychology. So you get a lot of like very specific mental health and psychological illusions and like explanations for things that are going on. Right. And I love speculative fiction that talks about the social sciences. So this is a great one for that. And I'm not going to speak to any larger picture sort of illusions that are being made here, but I think it is interesting that the thing that changes them has killed off something like a quarter of Nigerians, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to see this as their powers have come out of a massive national grief and personal griefs. But I love that it focuses on the personal aspect of how this has changed people and affected their experiences.
Total agreement.
Yeah, so the second story is Sin Eater by Chukwudili Emelumaru. This is another one that came from Omanana. Tiny Bravery also came from Omanana, and I highly recommend that speculative fiction magazine if you haven't read anything by them yet. So this is the story of a girl who is going to college, and she gets a very interesting roommate who happens to eat people.
This is
yummy.
One of two stories involving some form of cannibalism, by the way.
Yes, this is. So her roommate is a sin eater. So she is a creature that literally stalks and then consumes people who have committed great sins. And there's a really interesting discussion in it about, like, how do you know? And she's like, I just do. She has a ton of sisters who all do the same thing. None of them are male. It's just girls that do this. And the main character, who I don't think is ever named, basically becomes her assistant in pursuit of what she is doing and helping with the cleanup, because there is quite a bit of cleanup in terms of her power set, because, what goes in has to come out somehow.
Well, and when she eats when you say come out, right, she actually vomits out a lot of it.
Yes. It's not a pretty thing, but it's sins.
No. This one's a bit dark.
This is, I think, the darkest of the stories that we read.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting story about sex trafficking and rape and sexual assault, and they're not necessarily even sins that have been inflicted on the girl in the story. I don't think she ever mentions that.
Until the very end, and when one of the people attacks her, right? And the implication is he's about to do the very thing that he's done to everybody else, which it's a pretty brutal scene. I would say that this is one where if these kinds of themes...
Content warnings, yes, definitely.
Yeah, this one is, I would say, not an easy read. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really good story, but it is... Even that ending sequence is pretty uncomfortable. Involves some pretty blatant violence, both of asexual and of just physical nature.
Yes, very much so. And it's a tough one. Like, I've basically given you the summary just by saying it's about a woman who befriends a sin eater. There's more to the story, and I highly recommend, obviously, reading it, because the person who attacks her is a member of a group called the Buccaneers. They essentially sweep girls up in pursuit of victims for sex trafficking. I wasn't sure how I felt about this story because, like, the first story that we read, like, to me, there was a lot going on to that. I had a harder time connecting with this one. It didn't feel as nuanced to me, which is not to say that it's not a good story, but it's a much more straightforward sort of horror story, but dealing with really dark subjects.
One thing that I thought about while I was reading this, and I don't know if Emma Lamadu was thinking of this or was familiar with it, but it made me think immediately of Let the Right One In. Even though the thematics there's some similarities, but there's obviously a lot of divergence because Let the Right One In deals with bullying, which is, I think, lower scale on the sin level, you could say.
Right.
But I think there's like some thematic relationship there in the sense that people who, grow up being abusive towards others, in school don't necessarily shed that just because they become adults, right? Sometimes they become significant abusers outside of the school environment. But the thing that really I thought was interesting was that the main character and Nicedo, right, they meet and she becomes her like assistant in the same way that Oscar does of the vampire that's in Let the Right One In.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And it's different because there's an age difference, right? Which is to say that there's an innocence about Oscar that there maybe isn't about the main character in this story because she's an adult. And so there's a bit more of that separation. But there is, I guess you could say, some of that innocence still there in the sense that the very first instance when she meets the Nicedo is, like she walks in the hallway and there she is butt naked. And she's like, well, that's not so unusual. I went to all girls schools. But the unusual part is she's covered in blood. And then they have this conversation where Nicedo's like, oh, it's just my time of the month. And our character's like, I'm sorry, but usually when I bleed, I don't bleed that much. And I don't bleed out of my mouth.
Yeah.
And she's like, you caught me.
Right? It's an oddly comical story.
It is.
Given how dark the subject matter is. And that's because Nicedo herself, the Sin Eater, is very almost flippant about what her job is and who she is. And like the fact that she's always hungry is kind of hilarious because she literally eats people alive, but then has to like get rid of them. And she does so by, it sounds like it comes out everywhere, frankly. And then she's like, okay, now I need to eat. Let's go eat something. And you're like, what just happened?
There's like an interesting separation because Nicedo is, like you say, flippant, or she's sort of like disconnected from the seriousness of what she's doing because in a real world, right, like even though we tend not to be very sympathetic towards rapists, for example, I would say tend because perhaps the people that love that person may be sympathetic in a sense because they're a loved one. But we generally don't care that much. Like if someone punches a rapist, we don't really blink that much. But most of us would shy away from like just outright, if we had the ability, eating a rapist and then vomiting out the ichor that comes out as a result. And so there's a lot of like murdering going on here, right? People are being murdered. And yes, those people are bad people, but Niceto doesn't seem to have like any like concept of the consequences of that. And maybe that's because we don't really know, but maybe a consequence of doing it so many times that you just become disconnected from it, which is possible. Or maybe it's something to do with the nature of her being. But compared to the main character, like she is disconnected at first, but you realize really quickly that by her being involved with Niceto, she's actually being put in considerable danger.
She is.
Yeah, right. There's the alley sequence where she's basically followed by a man who I believe is poisoning children, as I recall, and to get killed. And then he realizes he's being hunted.
Well, no, he's poisoning his mistress so to get her children to sell them. So, yeah, exactly. That's why I say this is primarily a story about the fact that the Sin Eater Niceto is targeting sex traffickers. But she does say that she's new to this. So it seems more like it is part of her nature.
Oh.
Because she was literally just born, is kind of the impression you get when she talks about her mother, who bears Sin Eaters, whoever her mother is, and I don't know enough about the lore to comment on that. But her mother bears more Sin Eaters when they are necessary. And it sounds like they're really necessary at this point in time.
Yeah.
I actually love the fact that there kind of is this acceptance, because it's like she exists solely to stop these people from hurting other people. And so in her mind, she's not doing anything bad. She's just protecting people. And though the main character, unnamed narrator, is initially somewhat like discomfited by that, and she's like, why am I being used as bait? By the end, she knows that she's like, the last line is, I will never be alone again, because Niceto is there for her, and she knows that Niceto is there for her and other people like her. She knows that essentially women are being protected by these sisters, by these Sin Eaters.
Women and children.
Yeah. So it's a dark story, but oddly comical, and I don't know.
Yeah, there's certainly, I think, a trend under these stories that as people who, are not very familiar with the local cultures that some of these stories may be drawing on, there are things that we're missing. But I want to say, while I think that may enhance our interpretation of these stories, I think the fact that we don't know all of the culture that may be going into some of these isn't affecting the fact that we may be able to enjoy and still pick up on a lot of the themes, because a lot of the themes, even in this one, are themes that you see in other areas other than Africa, right? I mean, like, there's sex trafficking in the United States. And so, you could imagine variations of this kind of a story just told from, say, an American point of view, which would have a different take. I mean, we've seen movies that, they're not supernatural in nature, but there are American films in which people, like, take vengeance upon sex traffickers. I mean, for God's sake, the whole movie Taken is essentially that. It's racist, but that's a whole other problem.
Well, yeah, exactly. All right, shall we go into the next one?
Yes, please.
I know this is your story.
This one is my favorite story of the whole lot.
Exactly. So this story is from Lightspeed Magazine. It's called Between the Dark and the Dark, and it's by Deji Bryce Alukatun. So tell us about this story, Duke.
Okay, so Between the Dark and the Dark is a story that is split between two narratives, one that's taking place on effectively a generation ship, and one that's taking place on Earth, and you could say it's colonies, but primarily on Earth. There are sort of two groups. There's one who is a young man who is on one of these ships who exists in a culture which is engaging in some really unusual ritualistic practices, at least unusual by the expectations. And then there are the following of a character by the name of Steward Mafokeng, who is a steward, hence the name. And stewards are people who have been placed in charge of these various generation ships in order to monitor their progress as they escape the Earth. And we learn that there has been some sort of like crystalline alien thing that has come to Earth and decimated the planet. A lot of people who still live on Earth live underground. There are colonies that exist on the Moon and Mars. But for the most part, all of these ships being sent out are these like last-ditch efforts to find an alternative home to save humanity. And our main character, Stuart Mafokeng, has basically been roped into a bit of a political intrigue because the ship that the lead, steward is in charge of has been implicated in cannibalism, which is in essentially the constitution of this organization, an immediate instance of we shut the ship down and kill all the people on it, basically. The ship continues to go and deliver information, but you basically wipe out the population. And this has happened a number of times, including to Stuart Mafeking's prior ship. And so that's the sort of political intrigue going on here. And it's neat to kind of see the back and forth between the two, because you're sort of seeing people who don't have enough information because it's hard to get data from that far out, and people actually in the place. So you're getting different sides of the same coin, which is really interesting.
It is really interesting because what we find out by the end, because this is when Sean says 2 different spaces, this is almost 2 different timelines. The steward is operating something like 35 years after the events of the other timeline that takes place on the generation ship, which is called the Lion's Mane. And Mafeking isn't in charge of the Lion's Mane.
No, they were in charge of another ship that was destroyed, or well, the population was destroyed. The ship still exists.
Yes, but the person in charge of the Lion's Mane is Steward Hutchins, who is very quick to jump to the conclusion that his ship has participated in cannibalism and therefore should be destroyed. To the point that he actually makes a executive decision before putting it before a council to actually judge the people on the Lion's Mane. And it's a really interesting sort of societal view. It's an interesting world. It's a really interesting world that they're dealing with on 2 levels, because you have the broader sort of context of an Earth that's been destroyed mostly, and so generation ships have gone out. And then you also have the ship itself, which is a generation ship. So what has happened, what is happening, and that the time differential between those 2 spaces is super fascinating as well. And this is an anthropological science fiction?
Kind of, yeah, in a way, because the central question here is whether or not the rule, so it's an absolute rule, like no cannibalism. They don't specify the kind of cannibalism. Under no circumstances is cannibalism supposed to occur, but one of the philosophical debates that's happening here is whether or not certain forms of ritualistic cannibalism, or what we might refer to as anthropophagy, may be acceptable given the context of ships, going far and far and far away, and generations of people trying to survive on a ship with limited resources. And one of the reasons why this ship has engaged in anthropophagy, we learn largely through Stuart Mafeking speculating about what images and information they've managed to acquire, is they've solved a problem of keeping fish on a ship, so that you have an aquaponics system, essentially, because on the one hand, the water provides a barrier from radiation from space. On the other, it also provides food, but you have a nitrate problem, which is that they poop, but the poop and stuff that they make has too many nitrates, and so you can't grow plants, which you need to basically feed the thing. And so this society has discovered, well, if we basically genetically engineer our people over time, we can feed the people ritualistically to the fish, and this will fix the problem because their genetics have been altered so that the fish will eat them and not produce as much of the nitrates, and they'll produce something else that's more effective. There's a weird science going on here. It's not really, the science isn't that important. What's important is that the philosophical debate is being had about whether or not these static images that they've received, in which seem to suggest cannibalism, are indications of disease, in the sense of mental illness disease, of basically people losing their minds on Event Horizon and then eating one another, or if it's an example of a culture that has adapted over time because of its isolation. And Mafeking takes a very firm perspective here that it's actually human sacrifice in very specific situations and for a specific purpose, and that what we're seeing is not simple cannibalism, but actually honoring of the dead through the consumption of a little bit of the flesh, because there's a picture of a finger. And Hutchins hates it, because what he wants is he wants to preserve his legacy. He wants to be in power and everything, and Mafeking is the one dissenter. And this creates a huge political intrigue. Mafeking's almost killed at one point, possibly by Hutchins. It's very interesting, and it's a story after my own heart, because this is the lecture I give almost every single fall about cannibalism and why people's perspectives of cannibalism are probably wrong. And so the second Mafeking's going, well, anthropophagy, and like, let's talk about this. And I'm going, yeah, that's fucking right. Go.
Yeah, I know. The second I realized what it was about, I was like, this is totally Sean's cup of tea. What's also really interesting is that there actually still, I think, is a question.
It's not settled at the end.
Right, it's not settled. Nothing is actually settled because what they end up deciding is we need more information. That's what the council decides. We need more information because clearly we cannot make a snap judgment. But what we're learning on the other side, on the ship itself, is yes, Mafeking is probably correct to an extent, but to what extent they are correct is difficult to actually determine, even when you're seeing it from the side of the main character on the lion's mane.
Oh, I disagree completely. Mafeking's 100% correct.
Well, okay, yes, except that this is a situation of the lion's mane is essentially participating in a Logan's Run style system in order to control population size and also maintain food for the rest of the population.
But there's a difference, which is in Logan's Run, the people that exist within the system don't know that the outside world is actually safe. And they also believe that they're ascending to a higher plane rather than being disintegrated. Whereas on this ship, they know that human beings do eventually feed the fish, and that while dying sucks, it is actually a part of the ritual, and it is an honor to essentially be the one that is sacrificed. And so it's a different situation because the alternative doesn't necessarily exist.
But I do think that Mafeking is still lacking a lot of information, which is not necessarily necessary to deciding not to kill off 300 people, but I think it makes the anthropophagy a more complicated set of circumstances than simple sacrifice for the greater good.
So from Mafeking's perspective, certainly, because they only have a handful of images and some log information. We know that the images were sent on purpose, which is an important detail as part of the argument. So from Mafeking's perspective, yeah, Mafeking is speculating, and there's still at the end, they decide to cancel the signal that's going to basically end all of the people's lives, but only so that they can get more information to determine what's going on. But when we're from the opposite perspective, we're seeing anthropophagy being engaged in quite explicitly. Well, and actually, most of it isn't anthropophagy at all. There's human sacrifice, but only very little tiny amount of it is actually anthropophagy, of the consumption of human flesh for ritualistic purposes. There's only like a little bit. For the most part, the people's bodies are basically cut up and fed to these trout. And so from that perspective, we know 100% that the system is interesting. It may be complicated, but it is anthropophagy, and it is human sacrifice for a very particular purpose, right? And in this case, I would argue a very clear, obvious purpose, because the person's body is in fact being used explicitly. Whereas with Mafeking's perspective, we don't have that information for them. And so there's a lot of speculation and unknowns for their side, which I think is one of those interesting things, because this is dealing with that time dynamic, which is like, you can't just send instant messages via light speed to ships that are many light years away, right? It takes a lot of time. And so this is important. There's also some other aspects here which I think are interesting, which is that this ship is the one that has moved the furthest away that they know of, and still is in contact. And so there's a big concern of like, well, if we just keep killing off all these ships without trying to really figure out what's going on and being absolutely certain that we're making the right choices, we run the risk essentially of never having a ship reach any of its destinations.
That is 100% true. And I really liked the concept that this was specifically what they built the steward system for. The steward system is there to help and to guide, but in the end, they leave it up to the individual societies that develop on those generation ships to figure out what to do. And I thought that was a really, the world building in this is phenomenal.
It's great. This should be a novel.
Right? I want so much more of this. This is one of the most fascinating generation ships. Like, we don't actually know how many generations have passed, but it is fascinating to see regardless. The reason that I said that I found it more complicated was the system by which they choose people to become the sacrifices, and the fact that the sacrifices aren't necessarily all willing. And that's where, like, the one that we see through the eyes of is willing.
Yeah, that's true.
But he only becomes a sacrifice because of the fact that the ship society, or the rules of this society, have decided that he is not worthy of not being tested to see if he is worthy to continue alive or if he is best used as fish food.
Well, he's a genetic anomaly, as you remember, because in this generation ship, all of the children are supposed to be a combination of all of the, I forget what they call them, but basically like the upper caste, as it were, the people who are in charge of the ship. And so they're all supposed to combine their DNA to create the children, but he turns out to have been a product of, essentially, of love, of two people producing traditionally, essentially. And that creates a genetic anomaly that can't be accounted for.
No, and it's decided that that type of anomaly is less worthy of continuing on within the ship. So I think that's the part that kind of complicated things for me. I do think that Mifokeng is correct in their judgment of what is happening on the ship. However, I think the systems of the ship are much more complicated than even Mifokeng is aware of. Which obviously, because of the fact that, like, all they're getting is pictures. There are no text logs for them to judge from. I loved that. I love that this was like kind of like an investigative story, because Mifokeng is basically literally investigating an entire society based on like maybe 10 pictures.
Yeah, 10 pictures, some of which Hutchins has withheld.
Yes.
Because they're inconvenient for his story.
Exactly. So yeah. No, this is a brilliant story.
There's a colonialism reading of this too, by the way. A man named Hutchins telling a person named Mifokeng that they're barbarous, and also so are you because you support it, and you must be a barbarian too. And it's like, well, you know, Jam Kotsea wrote a whole book on this called, I believe, We Are the Barbarians.
Yeah.
Which I don't believe that book deals with anthropophagy, but this is a common narrative that like colonial governments had about basically everywhere else, which is like they're all barbarians because they all engage in cannibalism, and they're all evil and bad because they do it. And this story is essentially about like why that is an absolutely stupid kind of argument, because that's too simplified. You can't just attribute it to barbarism. There may be deep reasons for why you do it. Also, I love that there's a mention of the Catholics here. Fucking yeah. Because some Catholics actually believe that it transmutes into the flesh of Christ and the blood of Christ inside your body. And I just want to note, y'all is fucking cannibals.
That's true. Can I read the paragraphs, 2 paragraphs real quick?
Go for it. Yeah, go for it. And then we'll move on. We gotta go.
God, they're my favorite paragraphs in this. So the part that I think that speaks to what Sean just said starts with, and I quote, "Maybe this was why the words savages and barbarians kept repeating in her mind. The other stewards had used these words to justify destroying the crew, but she remembered how her own ancestors had once been described in those terms centuries ago, justifying their slaughter by the Gatling gun. Barbarians, savages, kill them all. And she recalled how the media had covered the loss of the Medallion, which is her ship, Mifokeng's ship, focusing on Captain Trent T-Man Dang, a man born and raised in Canada and touted as humanity's hope until the ship exploded, at which point he became Trent Dang, the child of Sudanese immigrants, his stature stripped to its barest essentials." And I find that really fascinating in the context of what is going on in America right now in terms of Black Lives Matter and how the media portrays people who are murdered by cops, specifically Black people that are murdered by cops, when they are stripped of their humanity and reduced to the one stereotype that the media wants you to see so that you judge them in the same fashion that a cop might have judged them at.
Well, and that's a colonial narrative too.
Exactly. So yeah, no, this is a great freaking story. Great story.
If you ever are curious about how far back this goes, I mean, it goes back further than this, but you can actually look at the historical moment after emancipation in which plantation owners began using marketing to sell the myth that black people were basically lazy and just ate watermelon all over the place, because that's when it starts to appear. I mean, it's before that. It doesn't appear specifically that moment, but it just becomes a flood, because what they were doing in some cases was saying, well, look, we don't want to hire them because they became free and they're lazy and they eat watermelon all day long and they won't do any work, which is ironic given that they're all fine enslaving them and make them work before. But what they wanted was, but also these indentured servants from India, we want them, because we can legally pay them next to nothing and make them indentured servants, and they're better workers. Also, if you want to feel really gross, there were people arguing that they should make a super slave race by having African people and Indian people reproduce, because there was the belief that African people have the bodies that is great for physical labor, but Indian people do not. But Indians are subservient and will work hard and do everything. So if you put them together, it's basically one of the first major eugenics ideas. It did not happen, although I'm sure someone tried. It's like colonialism is some fucked up shit.
It is some major fucked up shit.
And when you study it, it's amazing. Like, even the stuff that's like not the fringe ideas is like, you're going, wait, scientific racism? What the fuck is this nonsense? It's just all over the place. And cannibalism is part of it. There's books on it and articles and stuff. So if you've ever interested in reading it, this is the only time I'll ever recommend a Herman Melville story, which is Typee. And if you've ever read that, it deals almost explicitly with the fear that colonial people, British colonials, had of the idea that cannibals were on the islands, the various islands. Basically the whole story is about a guy who decides to go AWOL from his ship, and he knows there's two groups of islanders that are on this island, but he believes he knows that one of them are the cannibals and the other are not, but he doesn't speak their language, and so he spends the entire time being paranoid that every time he meets one of them, they're the cannibal and they'll eat him. It's a little bit comical because it's basically about like how absurd this belief is, especially since he goes the entire novel without ever actually being eaten. And yet he's still terrified.
Great. Sounds fantastic. On that bright note, we still have 3 stories to go. So the next story is Principles of Balance by Ivana Okatawa Ofori. This was published by Gelada Africa, which is a Pan-African writers collective, and they do anthologies and whatnot. So this story is about a betweener. A betweener is someone who can basically slip between 2 worlds. They essentially act as a messenger between the spirit world and the human realm, and they are hired, against their better judgment, by a woman with a child who is basically not quite alive, and whose spirit is trying to pass, but the mother won't let it because she wants her daughter. It's the only child she's ever had. She's afraid she can't have anymore. So she's desperately clinging to this child's life. And Nbelenyen is the main character's name, has to essentially act as the messenger between this mother and the spirit of the child. The mother wants Nbelenyen to convince the spirit to go back into the child's body, but Nbelenyen is like, that's not really my job. I don't do that. However, when the mother threatens Nbelenyen with essentially severing their ties from the spirit realm completely, so that they would essentially be both dead and not dead at the same time, but not able to move either, and their spirit would never pass beyond and be released. So they'd just be stuck in their decaying body, essentially, which sounds utterly horrifying. When that happens, they're forced to make a decision about what will happen to this child's spirit. Now, meanwhile, the child's spirit is that of an ancient man who has come back to life already 84 times. And the balance that is being spoken of here is that every time a spirit passes on from the human realm, a new one is produced and goes back into the human realm. But Nbelenyen doesn't really have anything to do with that balance because they're just a messenger. But in this case, because of the fact that they're being threatened, like I said, they're forced to make a decision, and that decision ends up disastrous for Nbelenyen in a really interesting way.
I don't know if I'd say disastrous. Disastrous would be getting stuck in their body for all time, rotting away.
But Anne Boleyn is stuck in the spirit realm.
Right. And this is because, once this sort of curse, as it is, has been placed on them, they go to something called a Canton Billy. And I'm not sure of the exact pronunciation of this, which are essentially like trickster beings of a sort that engage in some degrees of witchcraft. It's a little bit fuzzy on exactly what their relationship is to the various worlds. Are they witches or are they spiritual beings? I wasn't clear. But the point is that they go to this and they recognize that they're all kind of creatures that you can't always trust. And so they go there and they get this like flute thing and trick the spirit of the child. But in the consequence of that is that they themselves were tricked, and so they are stuck in the spirit world with all the creepy civets, which they keep telling us about. Because civets apparently are the Cheshire cats of the spirit realm in this world.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's how you went, but immediately when there's a civet talking to her, I was like, okay, I don't know anything about Ghana, and so maybe this is something that is part of Ghanaian belief structures. I don't know, but in my Western brain went Cheshire cat, and
No, definitely. Once you said it, I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly what the civets are. But what I found really interesting is, and you don't really figure this out until the end, I don't think Anne Boleyn, they are not referred to by a gender at all in the story, actually. However, I believe that betweeners are actually intersex, because one of the things that happens at the end is when they are severed, essentially, they lose their facial hair and their breasts grow larger.
oh, so they cease to be intersex.
Yeah, because betweeners are essentially the physical manifestation of balance, both male and female. And they can travel between both worlds, which is why they act as messengers. In this case, Anne Boleyn gets paid for passing messages over to the other side, sort of thing. So yeah, at the end, Anne Boleyn breaks the balance. And the balance broken here, you assume, because what happens is that the spirit of the child is forced back into the child's body. But that child was supposed to die. Like, there's not really any question of that in my mind. This child was supposed to die. The spirit that, for whatever reason, kept getting shoved back to Earth was not supposed to go back to Earth. But Anne Boleyn has made a decision for the spirit and thereby breaks the balance.
I would say it's a little more complicated in the sense that there's like this natural pull that the spirit gets. And this is one of the things that when they talk to the spirit's like, I've done this 83 times. I'm exhausted. And every time I do it, I get even more exhausted. And there's this great line later is like, do you have any idea like how old you have to be and how exhausted you have to be to do this over 83 times? Like to get to the point when you look that old in the spirit world, that's pretty severe. And so his perspective is like, I keep being pulled back into this. And while it is part of the natural order of things that, a child is born and then you're supposed to go into a new body. When you die, your spirit goes back into a different body, or new ones are made entirely. We're kind of told this. That pull is always there, but he doesn't want to go. I assume and effectively gets forced into it in a way that was a little bit different than what we had before, which is a pull in which he had some control over himself, and Boleyn basically takes that ability to do that away entirely, so it's a little complicated, but you're right. There is an aspect of choice being removed, which is, it is unfair. And of course, I think that's part of like the irony of the balance, right? Things balancing out. It's like, well, you have done this thing to somebody else. You've crossed this line, and to counterbalance the harm you've just done, you now must suffer this fate of being trapped in the spirit world. I think it's interesting that the ending tells us that they become gendered, but it doesn't. It sort of stops there and doesn't spend a lot of time with it. But there could be so much other story to tell about how that affects somebody psychologically, because that's a horror. I guess I would agree with you. That is pretty horrifying. I didn't really consider it at first, but you're right. It maybe isn't quite the same as being stuck in your decaying body for all eternity, but it is still a horrifying, like your body has changed on you without without your choice, really. Like, you don't have any choice on what's happened to you.
No, by Embelenian deciding to take away choice from the spirit of the baby, they then have their choice taken away from them. But the thing that is getting stripped from them is it's their life, essentially, right? Because once they become a gender, not agender as in not a gender, but a specific gender, they can no longer pass between the two worlds. And so they are now stuck in the spirit realm.
With the civets.
And they've essentially been forced to take the place of the spirit that was in the realm while that spirit is now stuck in a baby's body that they didn't want to be in. And that child is likely to die because their spirit is so ancient, right? But the mother doesn't care. The mother has already stripped the choice from Embelenian in the first place, right? And so it's, regardless, the choice is stripped 2 times, right? Because Embelenian could have chosen to put the child out of its misery by giving the spirit the correct side. The baby would have died. The mother would have probably cursed Embelenian, but yeah, it's an impossible choice. And
it's not a good choice.
It's not. Like, this is...
I will just say, I don't... Maybe there's a line that I just missed, but I did not get the impression that if he's put back in the child's body, the child dies. My understanding is that the child's dying because the spirit's not in its body.
Well, the child is dying because the spirit is not in its body, but there is a moment that they talk about how if I go back into that child, it's going to die soon anyway. It's not going to live very long. That's what Embelenian explains to the mother.
Oh, yeah, because it may be too late.
Well, no, it's because the spirit that is supposed to go into the baby is just so old and so tired and so fixed in the spirit realm at that point. Like, they're just...
chewing his sticks.
Yeah, chewing his sticks and not wanting to go back to Earth. Like,
okay. All right.
So that was kind of the impression I got. Anyway, I'm going to let people make their own decision on that one, because it was a really interesting story. And I think it's a story about gender, but I feel like I'm missing some context somewhere.
Yeah, I feel the same. I think there's some cultural context here, because I know that some African cultures do have relationships between the spirit realm and children, and the spirit being within the child, but I am only familiar with that through The Famished Road by Ben Okri, which I think he's Kenyan. And so this is...
Ghana.
So
yeah.
I mean, I imagine there's some similarities, but there's got to be more here that we're just missing. So this is like one of those things where, like, this is why you need to read this stuff, because then you go, oh, I should go look up some things and learn and discover, and like, oh wow, there's all this interesting stuff. It's also possible, like, we're just like assuming there's more here, and these are just all made up, which is entirely possible too. In which case, good job, because you're making us think it's real.
It's exactly. And I have to admit, like, I really enjoyed trying to find further context in all of these stories. And this is one that there's a lot of references to potentially specific cultural touchstones that I don't have access to. And I do absolutely, when I have more time, plan on looking all of those things up. So yeah, read the story, obviously. So you are up next.
That is The Haunting of 13 Olubo Street by Suyi Davies Okumboa.
I love this story. It's so sweet.
That's interesting. I enjoyed this story, but I wouldn't say it was my favorite. But I think it's because I read these in the order we're talking about them, and once I got to the cannibalism story,
well, obviously,
just like
it was all over for you.
Yeah, it was pretty much like, that's the one for me.
I love a good haunting story, so that's part of the reason.
This one's interesting. So Haunting of 13 Oluo Street is a story that, if I understood it correctly, is about a house in which a spirit lives, the spirit of a woman who has suffered a pretty horrible fate lives. And it is its narration of itself and its existence as it exists in a community that... I don't know how you describe. It's kind of hard to describe this story because it's so different from everything else we've got. But basically, the house exists. It breathes. The locals sort of recognize it and they respect the house. And it sort of narrates the life of its spirit, the spirit girl that lives within it. But also, there's these other interesting conflicts that exist between what effectively are like those ghost hunter shows keep showing up. and wanting to get the big scary ghost story. And there's some cultural differences that exist because the locals don't have the same relationship to the ghost narrative that people from the United States do. And we sort of learn as through the course of what's happened to this young woman who unfortunately had passed and has basically been haunting the house along with it. And that unfortunately is a pretty horrible ending. And that's kind of the story. The real interesting part of this is the details that are told. This is given to us in second person, which you rarely see. And the details here are really fascinating details because they're details about, various versions of the reader or various aspects of its existence or its relationship with the community and how it describes that relationship, or in some cases, the community's relationship with other people. I will admit, I definitely latched on here to all of the American references. They're a handful because it's not a terribly long story.
There are, indeed.
But for me, it was interesting because I immediately was starting to think about, I know what they're talking about. They're talking about like these ghost hunter shows and similar type shows and talking about how these people are essentially like wanting to manufacture terror. Mm-hmm. But this haunted house it's not a scary house, right? The thing that happened to the young woman is terrifying, but the house itself it's not a monster. It's not trying to eat people. It's not
Monster House.
It's not a monster house, right? This house is sort of this living, breathing being, but its goal is not terror. But all of these ghost hunters, they're expecting a haunted house like what Americans expect, like, the Haunting of Hill House, and I believe that's referenced at one point here, right? This idea that, like, it's an evil house, that, like, there's evil spirits, and they're gonna, like, scare you and, like, try to eat you and all of these things. And the locals are like, what are you talking about? Right? It's just like the house breathes. It's pretty chill. Like we just respect it and like, be nice to the house.
No, not exactly. I would say that one local, that's what they are saying, but we find out why later on in the story. Because no, this is not a ghost house. It's actually, if anybody has recently read John Wiswell's story, Open House on Haunted Hill, it's very similar because that's a story about a haunted house, quote, that is lonely and desperate for someone to buy and live in it. And this is a very similar sort of set of circumstances in that this is a house that, yes, has someone haunting it, and it is, in a sense, a haunted house, but it's also a house that just wants to welcome people into it and make them happy. That's its job as a house, right? But because of the fact that makes it a little bit weird in terms of normal houses, and also it has this woman, Moransade Awalea, crying constantly in its pantry, nobody wants to live in it. And so they keep, people keep coming to look at it, and then they leave, and then the American comes in and is like, I'm going to exploit this house. And one person, local guide, says, no, not going to help you. And they leave, but then the American leaves, and then they come back later and basically fake everything and force everything because...
Which those shows do.
Which those shows absolutely do. But it's really... There's actually somebody lives in the house for a while and is so sad that it actually outmatches Moransade, who's the ghost of the woman.
I was under the impression that this gentleman and the Moransade were of some relation, whether that was like a friendship or romantic or familial, because Moransade actually goes quiet at one point, and like they have a staring contest, although it's unclear to me if they're actually looking at each other or if they're just like a cat and a human, like just kind of in the same space but not necessarily aware of each other.
Well, supposedly she's visible, but the person who lives in the house, the gentleman who lives in the house, doesn't seem to see her because he's too overwhelmed by his own grief. Now, what's interesting is that the house eventually decides that this man who is living in the house and is so full of grief that they cry every single night, is a reminder of Moransade's trauma, and they eventually chase him out of the house. Whether or not he is the person who killed Moransade is kind of left up to your own imagination, but it seems as if his presence is awakening that fear in Moransade and in the house, because the house specifically is like, everything feels wrong. We no longer feel safe, no longer feel comfortable. There's only one person who lives in the house until the end.
Yeah, there's a different person that comes to the house at the very end, isn't there?
Yes, but that person is the person who was the person who guided the American to the house and then said, you need to be respectful, like respect this house, we respect our past. And so I think there's a really interesting reading here about sort of cultural trauma, especially regarding a place, because everybody is terrified of this space. For good reason. It is haunted. It is full of bad memories, essentially. And so most people don't want to live there because of that. And the neighborhood basically avoids the house as much as possible because there's like a specific ghost haunting it, yes, but also because there's just something off about the house in terms of like the cultural understanding. And the American essentially comes to try to exploit that.
Yeah.
And at one point, somebody does move in, but that reignites sort of the trauma of the location. And then finally, someone who loved Moransade basically eases her pain and then decides to live in the house.
Right. So that I was confusing the people because that's the last section that I was talking about before, right? Which is the person that seems to have had some relationship with her of some kind.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the person before that, I think, when you said earlier, I think you're absolutely right. I would say that person is heavily implicated in the person that probably put her in the state that she is in, which is essentially killed her.
Yeah, horribly. But I don't think it necessarily is the same person. I think it's somebody who is just enough of a reminder.
Oh, interesting. I don't like ambiguous houses, Jen.
This one, it's a little ambiguous, you know? I don't know. You can say, though, that by the end of it, you really just hate the American because he's a bastard.
Well, it's interesting because I watched this show on YouTube called Best Ever Food Review Show, and he recently did a whole sequence when he was in Lagos, and he ran into this interesting conundrum because a lot of the places where he was filming this, like people were like, yeah, what up, hi, let me be in your video, and like everything's fine. But when he got there, they were like, oh, what do you want to film me for? Like, you gotta pay me for that. Like, you can't just like take advantage of me. And he came to the conclusion through this whole thing that this is a place that has historically been so taken advantage of over and over that the people there basically are fed up with it and like look at anybody coming in with a camera and treat them as somebody who's trying to take advantage, and they're not going to have it. And so it's interesting that this kind of, in a way, is in this story in the sense that, right, this American hires this guide, and the American clearly wants to exploit, right, this area to treat it in a certain way, and the guy's just like, no, that's not going to happen. I'm not interested in this game.
That's interesting.
The American, he is exploiting, right? He's creating fiction in order to, and he's chosen this place, even though it doesn't explicitly tell us, but he's chosen this place because it's quote unquote exotic, right? Mm-hmm. He could have done this in backyard America somewhere, right? And made up the same stories, and probably nobody would have batted an eye, but he went here because he's looking for the exotic story. So he's already essentially treated this place as other. And so he deserves all the contempt we give him. Fuck that guy.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Well, what's interesting is I'm kind of like reviewing the story as we're talking about it. And the house doesn't exist until Moransade is killed. Well, the house, the spirit of the house.
The spirit of the house. It like coincides with her as a protective force.
Yes, exactly. It's really, and it's born from trauma. And I think that's the most interesting aspect of this story, is that this house and the haunting is all born from this horrible nightmare of a tragedy in terms of Moransade's murder. And it's not until someone basically shows their love of what they were before, of what the house was before, of what Moransade was before her murder, that they are not freed, but made at peace.
Yeah. It's a pretty good story. I enjoy it.
I did too. It's a beautiful... I love haunted house stories, though, these days. Like, I've decided that haunted house stories are just the best things ever.
Okay, I will write you a haunted house story.
Thank you, especially the ones that aren't necessarily about a malevolent house, but houses that are, in some way, shape, or form, that they exist to be houses. Does that make any sense?
like you're looking for a house that's alive, but it is alive as anything else is alive. It has its own wants and desires, and it's not intending to terrify everybody.
Right. It might accidentally do so.
It's not trying to eat people.
Yeah. And again, I highly recommend both this story and then John Wiswell's story, Open House on Haunted Hill. It's up on Diabolical Plots. It is a beautiful story.
Absolutely. So, last one, Jen. What's the last story?
The last story is a delight of speculative fiction. There are 2 stories that have been nominated that are like straight up science fiction. And that's Between the Dark and the Dark. And then this story, which is called When We Dream We Are Our God by Woltalabi. It was in Apex magazine last year. So this is a first-person narrative of a man talking to his son about how and why he chose to become a god. And he talks the son through the steps as essentially as justification for his abandonment of his child. I mean, let's be honest. But also as an invitation to his child to become something greater and part of this boundless community. So basically, this is a singularity story about how an AI gains consciousness, but decides that people are beneath its notice, except that by making that decision, it rejects humanity. Not in an antagonistic way, but in a like, you're so small and beneath me that I don't even care about you. And if that means that some of you might accidentally die, that's a possibility that I don't actually care about because you are nothing to me. And the way we find that out is that this Ganesh is the AI. Ganesh has basically turned the internet off a couple of times because it legitimately just does not care if anybody's using it because it's all for itself, sort of thing. So what we find out is that the narrator posed Ganesh a question, and in asking that question was provided a solution that basically makes everybody a part of this singularity if they decide to take something called Omi Legba. I had to look up both Omi and Legba. I kind of knew who Legba was. So Legba is one of the traditions of Nigeria, and also obviously the Caribbean has Papa Legba. But in this case, the name is Legba because Legba was the god that allowed people to communicate with the gods, essentially controlled the gateway between the humans and gods. And Omi means water. So what this Omi Legba is essentially you are injected with nanotech, and that networks all other people that have all since taken the Omi Legba with Ganesh. Because the question he asks is, what if we become your eyes and ears? Because Ganesh technically is limited by what people create for Ganesh to act as its eyes and ears. So the narrator essentially comes up with the idea of, we aren't useless though. We do have meaning, and we can become a part of you, a part of this singularity, and then we can learn all together all about everything. And it's really fascinating what this networking does to humanity. So it talks about like some of the things that have been accomplished basically immediately after thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people have taken the Omi Legba and become networked. They're able to solve like cancer and some mathematical problems that everybody thought was like completely impossible and all these other things because the collective intelligence is there. Now, I really liked this story because I like singularity stories, but I haven't decided if the Omi Legba is a good thing or a bad thing. And I don't think this story necessarily tells us that.
I don't think that it does. I think there's a bit of ambiguity implied in that because right they're attempting to. He says this explicitly in the story, right? The narrator, which is this idea that we humans have always sought connection, both good and bad, and that ultimately they've taken this process to become godlike in order to draw that connection with this singularity, and that's. I think seems inherently positive, right? Drawing connection and changing ourselves in the process of connection with others. But you're also like making pretty substantial changes to yourself. And so I think there's, whether this was intended or not, an implied question of what is human at that point do you remain human, or do you become God, as the title suggests, and therefore your humanity disappears? I don't know. I mean, this story reminded me a lot of Her.
Oh, see, and I haven't watched Her quite yet, so.
I think aside from the fact that it's almost all white people, I think
Yeah.
I think you'd like it mostly because it is about the kind of social science fiction that you really like, and it deals with these kinds of questions, just dealing with it in a different way in terms of the things. But it's dealing with the questions of, what are human relationships when you insert artificial intelligence into it? This story comes up to the point of, like, at the end, the question is raised, but it's not trying to answer it. Her attempts to answer it in its own unique way. And so I think that's an important distinction here. So I think there's ambiguity here. I really struggled with this story a bit, if I'm honest. And I think just mostly because I just felt like I was being told what happened. And I think the story I really preferred to have read would have been the story after the end of this one.
Yes, because this is actually happening pretty quickly after the narrator has become part of the collective. I will grant you that I, as a Star Trek watcher,
you went there too.
have a little bit of a negative reaction when discussing things like collectives. Obviously, like, I've been essentially culturally conditioned by Star Trek to not trust collectives. And yet, on the other hand, I was raised by people. My father's family were part of a commune, utopian socialist commune. So that is a form of collective. And at this point in my life, I'm basically a communist, which is another form of collective growth and support and all of those things. And the narrator specifically says that he is separate but together. The question is, how separate? How much of himself does he maintain? And my worry is, especially since this is a story to his son, that he is less separate than he necessarily thinks he is, and is somehow writing this story to explain to his son why he is no longer quite as present in the son's life.
Well, and also the fact that the story ends by him presenting his hope to his son that his son will join him in the collective.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And his wife is divorcing him.
Yeah, it's because his wife doesn't...
She doesn't understand. And you're like, well, but does she though?
But think about it, right? Like, I mean, like, if you think about it, how can you really understand if you're not really a part of it, right? I mean, if you're separated from this collective, it's hard to sort of fully conceptualize. I mean, the story's trying to give us that, but it's even difficult for us because we're not part of a collective in the same sense, right? And I think it's interesting you went for the Star Trek reference because, yeah, the Borg, but what's different here is there's like an aspect of choice that this person's willingly become part of this collective, which is completely opposite to the Borg, where it's like, it's not even a choice. Like, we're the Borg, you will be assimilated, resistance is futile. This one is like, here's my argument for why doing this was really great. And also, son, I hope that you follow me, but your mom didn't get it. And like, that's cool,
Right.
And to be fair, like, I imagine if like I were in a relationship and my significant other was like, I'm going to join up with this AI and become part of this collective of many other people. How do you have a relationship at that point? Because Her deals with this in a different way, but it does try to address this problem of like what happens when, your significant other is able to have relationships with all of these other people and you can't connect with that in the same way. Like, can you have a normal relationship at that point, or does it change into something that most humans just can't conceptualize and can't work into their expectations of how relationships work?
So think of this in the sense that, because he specifically is saying that the collective, and therefore himself, because he is part of that collective, the we are our God, is, look at Mr. Manhattan in Watchmen, who literally is incapable of a quote-unquote normal human relationship because he is so far beyond humanity. And therefore, he neglects the sort of day-to-day needs of people that are in relationships with him.
Right, because he exists or can perceive like all of time, basically.
Yeah, and that's essentially what this collective has become. They have become a god. And how does a god have a relationship with someone who is not connected to the world in that same fashion? So I think you're right. I think the story after this would be really interesting to see. Like, I want to know how far this goes. But at the same time, this character as a god will become less and less sympathetic to an extent as it sheds its individual humanity.
Yeah.
In pursuit of something so much larger.
I think part of also why I would be interested to see the story that follows this is, you raise this thing of like, how does a god relate to those that are not gods? And given that this is coming from a Nigerian writer, in Western writing, right, we have answers to that. We have like the Greek myths, like what happens when a god interacts with not gods. Well, it's not so good for the not gods.
Yeah. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well.
Usually not, right? If we're dealing with the Greek gods, not all the time, but most of the time it ends bad. Even the gods that are not inherently evil, like I would argue Zeus is, right? Even they can be tricksters, right? They can be manipulative. And then you have things like, Christianity, which has its own sort of take on when God meets non-gods, right? And if we have the Bible to kind of work with, right? Most of those interactions are positive, except for Job, who just gets effed over. And then, like, everyone's like, oh, how great, you kept your faith. And it's like, well, fuck that God.
Sort of positive. The Christian God is not exactly a forgiving God.
He's not a very nice God. He's nicer than Zeus, because at least he doesn't come down as like a goose or something and then have sex with your neighbor. But anyway, so the point is, like, I'd like to see, like, what would Talabi's perspective be? How is he approaching this? Would he take a Western perspective, or would he borrow more Nigerian perspective, or some melding of the two, or something completely different? And he just went like, you know what? Like, my brain I am part of the collective, so, I don't know. Because this story, like, it gives us an aspect, a portion, but there's definitely more to come that could be written, which I want to see.
Yeah, I liked this in the sense that it is a justification to a son why a father is being shitty.
Yeah, which you don't always get.
Right? But couched in this interesting, world of a singularity. That's why I liked this story. And other people are going to see totally different things about this. I'm like, for me, though, it was basically just a shitty dad going, son, I have my reasons for being kind of shitty. And you're like, but is that a good reason, Dad? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, we did it.
We did it. We went way longer than we were planning on. But this was 6 stories, y'all.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. And they were all beautiful stories. Like, this really is a fantastic lineup in terms of an awards. I'm excited to see who wins.
We'll find out.
I'm very curious. We will find out. I'm not sure when they're doing the announcements for the Nommos this year, but we will update everybody when it gets to that.
Yeah. And keep in mind, all of these stories are available online. There are places like Omanana, Lightspeed, Apex, and Gelada Africa. There'll be links in our show notes to all of these and to the Nommo Awards. But, you can read them for free, but also if these places have ways that you can either buy issues or support them in other ways, please consider it, because the places that are releasing this stuff are releasing great work.
They really are. And meanwhile, you can also donate to the African Speculative Fiction Society, and they're doing a lot to really get more stories to Western audiences. And I, for one, super, super duper appreciate it.
Me too, because I would love it if we could have more international SF as just a thing that exists and not a thing where we're having to like do special issues. Not that those aren't great. I like those. They're great, and I know Strange Horizons on their Kickstarter is doing an SEA one, but I just would love it if it wasn't unusual to sort of plug into like fantasy and science fiction or Clarksworth's kind of, they do lots of Chinese, but you get there, like to plug into a science fiction magazine here, and it would be like, oh, there's a writer from Nigeria, or there's a writer from, I don't know, India or whatever. Like, that would just be normal, because I would love that instead of being like, well, what percentage of these are all people who are in the United States, and which one's the one Canadian and one UK guy who got in?
And then, of course, check out the other categories of the Nommo Awards because there are some amazing novels on this list.
There really are. This is another reason I'm really happy that the Nommo Awards exist and that the African Speculative Fiction Society exists, because it's helping to sort of support this work and so we can get more of it. Because I remember studying African literature just in general, and African because we mostly did like 3 countries because that's all school could handle, I guess, as just 3 African countries. But we covered that a little bit in school, but I kept thinking to myself of like, well, where's the genre fiction?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's like, and I didn't mean like Amos Tutuola, who is the palm wine drinker, which it borrows very heavily from folk tales and narratives of his native land. But like, where's the science fiction and where was all of that? And now we're getting so much of it. And I'm like super stoked because like I just got one of the books that's one of the Nommo nominees that, you know, it's like got space travel in it. Okolotun, who's one of the people we talked about, he wrote a book called Nigerians in Space, which, contrary to the title, is most of the part is not actually about Nigerians in space. It's about a lot of other really interesting science fictional topics. But the point is, there's lots of really cool stuff out right now, and I'm really happy, and I want us to keep supporting it.
Absolutely, 100%, definitely. Which is why I keep suggesting we talk about the Nommo Awards. So here we are. Let's keep doing it, and that leads us to ending the show.
So as always, if you want to support the show, patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty. If you'd like to get access, you can go read about that there. You can also find us on SkiffyandFanty.com, or you can follow us on the Twitters at SkiffyandFanty. That is the social network we use the most. We're also on Facebook at Facebook.com/SkiffyandFanty. We also have a BookTube, YouTube.com/SkiffyandFanty. We also have a newsletter, SkiffyandFanty.com/newsletter. That is run by Stephen Geigen Miller, who does a fantastic job. So, as always, you can also subscribe to us on pretty much anything. So if you're listening to this, you're not a subscriber, please subscribe on iTunes, CastBox, whatever it is that you use. And please, iTunes reviews especially, super important. We would love to have more reviews of the show. We have 26 on our feed, and we would like 6,347.
Indeed. And in the meantime, you can find me at Loop-de-Loo.
And me at Sean Duke with a U.
And now it comes time to Duke do something really awkward.
You know what, Jen? Halfway through this podcast, I took off one sock.
Why would you do that?
Because you are leaving me no options on which clothing I'm allowed to take off, Jen.
You're not allowed to take any clothing off, Sean.
It's hot, and my foot is hot, so my left foot is bare, and you can deal with it, and I know that you are repressed and you can't handle nudity, but you're just gonna have to deal with my one foot being naked.
Gross.
Gross. Awkward ending, and scene.
Bye.
If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty. You can also find us on our website, SkiffyandFanty.com, and on Twitter at SkiffyandFanty. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so at SkiffyandFanty@gmail.com. The music for this episode comes from Sphere by Creo. You can find out more about their music at freemusicarchive.org.